Welcome to Hydrogen Rising, a bi-weekly podcast created and hosted by the global law firm K&L Gates that brings you analysis of critical, cutting-edge issues impacting the global hydrogen market. We look forward to your engagement and feedback. And of course, don't hesitate to reach out if you have ideas about new topics you'd like us to cover.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Hydrogen Rising. I'm your co-host, David Wochner, and a partner in the Washington, D.C. office of the global law firm K&L Gates. We've got a great program today for episode 14. I'm joined by my Seattle-based partner, Alyssa Moir, and we're going to have a discussion today around water resource issues, something that, in my opinion, does not get enough attention in all the conversations we're having around the development of hydrogen at scale. Alyssa is a partner in our Environment, Land, and Natural Resources practice group, and among other areas, focuses her practice on water resource issues in the United States. And I've had the pleasure of working with Alyssa over the last few years on a number of issues. So very excited, Alyssa. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
So maybe let's level set for our listeners at the beginning. Why are we talking about water resources? So as everyone knows, the chemical composition of water is H2O, right? So each molecule of water is composed of 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom. Those regular listeners to Hydrogen Rising will be familiar with our discussion of the different colors associated with hydrogen production. Green hydrogen is produced from water via a process known as electrolysis. That process separates the hydrogen from the oxygen. And of course, substantial quantities of water are required for this process. And I want to get into that in our conversation today, Alyssa. Similarly, even in blue and gray hydrogen, which is produced from natural gas, water is required for the steam methane reforming process. So it is a water-intensive industry, no doubt. So, Alyssa, we have listeners really from all over the world. I think we've picked up somewhere between 20 and 25 countries in regular subscribers to Hydrogen Rising. Many of our listeners, maybe fully understand the importance of water resources to hydrogen production, understand that capacity constraints on water can present issues, but they really have no idea how water is regulated, kind of the legal framework around water in the United States. Can you take just a few minutes here at the outset and give our listeners a high-level overview of the kind of U.S. framework governing water resources?
Sure thing, David. I'm happy to. So first, just to level set, I'm coming at this from a water quantity perspective rather than a water quality angle. So water quality is an important consideration, but quantity is the gating issue here. And that's kind of where I play the most, is in water resources quantity. At the federal level in the U.S., we don't really have one federal agency that acts as a water allocator. The closest thing might be the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, but most of that agency's authority is just in the West, centering around the dam projects. The U.S. Supreme Court can also get involved if there are disputes between states, such as the recent Florida v. Georgia decision, which was kind of an urban population versus shellfish growth issue. And there was an interstate compact around that, which is what brought it to the U.S. Supreme Court. But most of our listeners, I imagine, don't want to end up in the U.S. Supreme Court. So
for sure,
that's kind of where water resource issues are at play at the federal level. So really, mostly they're governed at the state level. And this makes sense because we have such a vast geographic variety in the U.S. Our primary geographic split when it comes to water, it's kind of like the Mississippi River, runs down the middle of the country and it splits us between east and west. So that's created 2 really different water rights regimes. The one in the east is called riparianism, and the one in the west is called prior appropriation. And then there's a few other things in between, like Texas, because it's its own being, has its own kind of water rights regime. And then there's some mixes in the kind of middle of the country, but mostly we have riparianism and prior appropriation. So I'll start with riparianism. That evolved in the eastern U.S. There's just a lot more water and it rains regularly. I'm from the Midwest where you can expect a thunderstorm or you can expect a rainy day. It's going to rain all day, right? And so there's just more water. And if you own property on which water sits or flows through or is it adjacent to, you basically have a right to use that water, as long as you do it reasonably. And there's all sorts of questions about what is reasonable use, but that's the gist of it. Riparianism is evolving in response to more demand on the resource, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, but that's the basic concept in the East. And then as you move west, it's a lot more arid, right? So especially when you move west of the Rocky Mountains. When you're thinking about like Nebraska, some parts of Wyoming, there's kind of mixed regulated riparianism. But then you get further west and we've got prior appropriation. So this regime evolved where water is a lot more scarce. And it requires water users to have applied for a water right permit and established that they're putting that water to the use that they applied for, the intended, quote, beneficial use. And then if they can prove that over a certain course of time, they've earned this water right, which is kind of a paper document, right? You've got the wet water, which is the actual water, and then the dry water, the paper water. And even then, even if you earn this right, if you don't use your water for a certain period of time, you lose it or you relinquish it. So use it or lose it. That right returns to the state. It's made available to another user. And then there's also this other concept that's really important called first in time, first in right. So if you, for example, have a water right from 1900 and me as your upstream neighbor has a water right from 1910, your right is senior to my right. And so in a drought year, I have to let the water flow by my property. I can't use it so that you have access to your water right first in time, first in right. So that's why in the West, we say that whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting for.
I like that, and as a whiskey drinker, I particularly like that. That's interesting. It also strikes me that, and we can talk about this later, but as a growing industry, that whole first in time, first in right issue becomes particularly appropriate for new entrants into the market. I think that orientation was very helpful for our listeners. So if we dive in a little bit deeper now on hydrogen specific. I know over the course of your career, you've worked with a number of large industrial clients, helping them with water resource issues, allocation issues, jurisdictional disputes. Currently, 95% of the world's hydrogen, roughly, is produced from fossil fuels, predominantly natural gas. And while steam methane reforming process uses water, in the process, it is substantially less water than the production of green hydrogen via electrolysis. So, Alyssa, this is something I want to focus on with you a little bit. As I understand it, to produce green hydrogen, it can require up to 9 tons of high purity water to produce 1 ton of hydrogen. I want to give our listeners some comparative kind of assessment here. I expect many folks will have heard of Saudi Arabia's announcement to build the largest green hydrogen facility in the world, which would produce 650 tons per day of green hydrogen. So again, 9 tons of water to produce 1 ton of hydrogen. Can you first help us understand briefly about these numbers in the context of water resources, particularly in the United States? As you said, you focus on quantity. And then what are some of the issues that a nascent industry like green hydrogen should be thinking about with regard to the water resources?
Sure. So based on some really rough math, the facility that you're describing in Saudi Arabia sounds like it requires about 6,000 tons of water per day. So in the water rights world, that translates to just about 5 acre feet. And that's one of the common measurements we use when we're talking about water quantities. And so for our listeners, and this evolved from agriculture, right, which is so water dependent, 1 acre foot is what it takes to cover 1 acre of land with 1 foot of water. So you can visualize that. I can, at least in my mind. It's really important to keep in mind, though, that in the water rights world, water resources world, we regularly transact at much smaller scales. So even, there can be a transaction that's centered around 0.02 acre feet because that's all a particular user needs for whatever it might be. I mean, it can go up, but 5 acre feet is a lot of water.
Yeah, and to your point on that, I mean, distinct from most other water users, even large-scale water users.
Correct. Right.
Yeah. So then, with that in mind, what are some of the issues that a nascent industry like this needs to be thinking about?
Yeah, so to steal a term from our real estate colleagues, location, right? So, we're talking about big chunks of water, big blocks of water. And while it may seem that the easy answer is, well, just site a facility in the eastern US anyway, in a riparian regime where there's just simply more water, that could get a little squishy at times. So As we know, there are constraints from population pressure, competing industries. Climate change is changing the way water is used, the way the water is available for use in various areas. So it's forcing these riparian states, I think I mentioned earlier, to kind of re-examine what reasonable use means and really kind of look at their riparian regimes and kind of ratchet down. So some of them are increasing their monitoring and reporting requirements. That's a change we see coming, and it's already coming, has already been established. Others are requiring permits, so similar to a prior appropriation state, saying, hey, if you're going to use X amount of water, you need to have a permit, and you need to show us how you're going to use it, and you need to monitor and report. That's right now usually for bigger chunks of water, but certainly an industry like green hydrogen would fit into that category. So even though it's a little counterintuitive to think about citing a water needing industry in an arid place, it may be advantageous to think about citing a green hydrogen facility in a state that's a prior appropriation regime. And that's because those water codes have been evolving for such a long time. There's just potentially more regulatory certainty in a prior appropriation state. Your initial transaction costs might be a little higher, but they just will probably ensure more long-term certainty around your water right, as long as you're continuing to use it the way that you said you would and put it to beneficial use. So as I think about this, there's some really interesting pockets in the Western US. So Western Washington, where I live, for example, Western Oregon, Northern California, which used the prior appropriation regime because it evolved around gold mining and agriculture, over 100 years ago. But it's a pretty wet part of the state. I mean, Seattle is notorious, right, for all of its rain.
Yeah.
So those could be really interesting places to think about citing a green hydrogen facility because there's more water, but they have this prior appropriation regime that gives it a little bit more certainty around your water use and your water right.
That's helpful. It struck me too, as you were talking about kind of what's happening on the East Coast, and that some states are beginning to require permits for larger volumes of water. What that does, it seems to me, as states are making decisions on climate change, or at least with a climate change focus, it begins to create a balancing regime, right, for those states. If using all of that water produces green hydrogen, how does the state balance those effects? Green hydrogen is great. It means you're burning less fossil fuels for combustion purposes, but at the same time, you're using this valuable resource, water, that could have potentially harmful environmental effects through using all of that water. So that's going to be a tough thing, I think, for states to grapple with.
Absolutely. Yeah, we grapple with it here when it comes to a hydropower perspective, kind of an old energy production, but it takes water. It's carbon free, but it relies on dams, which have water impacts to species, water use impacts. So it's a new yet familiar kind of push and pull between the different resource needs and uses.
Interesting. So maybe we'll kind of end on this, because I think from working with you over the years, and I know kind of it's more of an innovative new development, I've heard you talk about water banks. Can you help educate me and Hydrogen Rising listeners a little bit on what water banks are and how it may be helpful here in the hydrogen context?
Yes, absolutely. Water banks are really exciting to me. This is an area that I really just love digging into, especially in this energy transition that we're all experiencing. And, the reason we're having this podcast is because of this energy transition. So I'll try to give kind of a basic overview, and probably the best way is just to provide an example from one that I'm working on right now. So usually these exist in prior appropriation states, again, because there's this regime that's a little bit more structured and set up. And the sophistication varies region to region. In certain areas, for example, Eastern Washington, which is agriculturally dependent, they've been water banking for a little while now, and they've kind of got it dialed in. The agencies are used to it, the users are used to it. In areas where they haven't had to do it as much, it's still a little nascent, and everyone's still kind of working together to figure out how it works and understand it. But so for the one that I'm currently working on, it is a coal-fired facility that is transitioning away from coal. Kind of getting back to what you were talking about, for greenhouse gas reasons, our state is no longer allowing coal-fired power. This facility has an enormous water right, over 25,000 acre feet. So we discussed that number earlier. As you can see, it's a huge amount of water to produce coal-fired power. Once they transition away from coal-fired power, they no longer need this water. But because we sit in a prior appropriation state, if they don't use it, they lose it. They would relinquish it to the state agency. And it's an extremely valuable resource. This facility is not going away. They're just transitioning their power. So they are using a statutory tool that we have here in Washington, and some other states have it as well. It's called here the Trust Water Agreement. And so we put it into a trust with our state agency that oversees water resource use. And essentially that means that's the bank. It goes into trust and that's the bank. So the wet water itself right now in trust will remain in the river where they're pulling it from or where they used to pull it from. The paper water stays with this particular entity. The cool part is this entity has basically become a water banker in partnership with state agency. The banker can make their water right, or a portion of it, because if we're talking about 25,000 acre feet,
It's a lot.
it's going to be a small portion.
Right.
You can make it available for new and different users. So, you can make it has been water used for industry, for coal-fired power, but you can make it available for municipalities, agriculture, irrigators, tree nurseries, water parks, or it can just stay in the river for in-stream flow for fish. So enter green hydrogen producers who are thinking, where am I going to get this water? Where is it going to be certain that I can get it and keep it and use it? And gosh, people are telling me there's no, quote, new water rights available from the agencies. What do I do? They can go to a water bank and say, we'd like to buy a portion of your water. And then they work together with the water banker and the state regulatory agency, which kind of oversees and makes sure that this is all regulatory compliant, to buy a portion of the water right, change the use, change the place and purpose of use, and start using it to produce green hydrogen. So they're really interesting mechanisms to me, still working out a lot of the kinks. There are people that are concerned that water banks are consolidating a natural resource in ways that shouldn't be possible. So there's pressures on this tool, but I think it's a really exciting way to think about converting the use of a resource from one kind of traditional area to an entirely new way of producing power. And I think it's something that green hydrogen producers, when they're looking to site, should ask around, hey, first of all, what are the water constraints in the area? And is there a water bank from which I could potentially purchase this water and, be really secure in my right to use it? So thanks for asking, because I think it's a great tool in this transition.
Yeah, a couple just kind of small follow-ups. I'd be curious first, when the new user, kind of repurposes the use of the water, is that a regulatory process? They have to go to an agency and get something approved? Is that how it would work?
Yes, they have to go to, in Washington, for example, it's the Department of Ecology Water Resources Office. They would have to apply for a mitigated permit. And so the agency would then take a look at the use, take a look at the potential impacts, and the overriding factor is that they cannot impair junior users downstream. So when I talked about that example of earlier, have to make sure that your use doesn't impair junior users. So the other beautiful part about water banks is that if it's built on a right that's older, so for example, the original water right fueling the coal-fired facility, let's say it came from 1940, that's really valuable, because that means that right is senior to a lot of other rights downstream from that new use.
And it would carry through.
It carries through.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And then I guess the second follow-up would be, how many do you have a sense of how many states are either allowing this or thinking about? I mean, is there a place where people can follow what's going on in this? I'd be curious about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I know in Washington, obviously, it's a usable tool, and there's all sorts of really interesting sites, kind of brokers being set up to between the bankers and the buyers. And I know that certain small, similar situations have been set up in Oregon and California. I would love to think that other states, even in the East, are looking at these examples and thinking around how they can be used as we go forward, because water is a resource that will continually be more and more constrained. And if we've got legal tools like this to help allocate it, especially as we transition in all sectors of the economy, I think banks are a very useful way to do that.
And I think that's actually an excellent point to close on. I think what you've highlighted for folks is really educational. So, thank you very much, Alyssa, for coming on. It's been very interesting to have you on Hydrogen Rising today. These issues are not going away. As you've highlighted, they're going to continue to grow, and I expect we'll hear more and more. So hopefully we can maybe do a part 2 down the road and have a new discussion as some of these developments emerge.
That'd be great. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. Thanks as always, too, to our listeners for joining us today. If you like what you hear on Hydrogen Rising, don't forget to subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. And of course, don't hesitate to give us 5 stars in the podcast app. And if you have any questions about the water resources issues discussed today, please reach out to us. You can find both me and my partner, Alyssa Moir, that's Moir, and our entire hydrogen team on our website at www.klgates.com. And of course, stay tuned for the next episode of Hydrogen Rising in 2 weeks. Thanks again.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Hydrogen Rising. Be sure to subscribe to receive timely notifications of future episodes, and check out our market-leading publication, The Hydrogen Handbook, on our website at www.klgates.com.